The work of art, therefore, demands another element of its existence, the God another mode of coming forth than this, in which, out of the depths of his creative night, he descends into the opposite, into externality, into the determination of the thing which lacks self-consciousness. This higher element is language, an outer reality that is immediately self-conscious existence. Just as the individual self-consciousness is immediately present in language, so it is also immediately present as a universal infection. The complete separation into independent selves is at the same time the fluidity and the universally communicated unity of the many selves. Language is the soul existing as soul. The God, therefore, who has language for the element of his shape is the work of art that is in its own self inspired, that possesses immediately in its outer existence the pure activity which, when it existed as a thing, was in contrast to it. In other words, self-consciousness in the objectification of its essence abides immediately with itself. Abiding thus with itself in its essence, it is pure thought, or the devotion whose inwardness in the hymn has at the same time an outer existence. It retains within itself the individuality of self-consciousness. And this individuality is at the same time heard as a universal individuality that is immediately present. Devotion, kindled in the manifold units of self-consciousness, is conscious of its act as the act of all alike and as simple being. Spirit, as this universal self-consciousness of all, has its pure inwardness, no less than the being for others and the being for self of the individuals in a single unity. Here in paragraph 710, we've now hit a really important transition point, a transition point in terms of medium, or as Hegel is going to term it, element, and he's using this, transliterated term Elemente in German. And the element that's a higher element in the sense of being more adequate to the requirements of the work of art, that is a way in which spirit through religion knows itself, is going to be language, Sprache, right? And it's not just any old language or the fact that we are linguistic beings. It's going to be determinate modes of language, as we're going to talk about in just a moment, and in the next paragraph as well, when he brings in a different kind of mode, use, development of language in a religious context. But this movement, this transition to language itself is incredibly significant. In a certain way, it's very, as we say, very meta, right? Meaning that it applies to itself, because the entirety of the phenomenology and all the work that we've been doing and all the commentary about it has been mediated through language. Talking about the statuary and the worker and the crowd of people worshiping within a temple, we're picturing that partly through imagination in our minds, right? So there's some visual elements to it. But it's linguistic. We are communicating about it. We never get away from language. And for Hegel, language and thought are intimately connected with each other. Now, Hegel does not have any sort of overarching theory of language or a treatise on language, as we might have hoped that he would have put out, given how deep a thinker he is and how many things he's talked about. That will come with later thinkers, in the 19th and 20th centuries. He does have some contemporaries who are very interested in the nature of language, but Hegel himself just brings it in here and there. But it is very important. So he says the work of art, therefore, demands another element of its existence. And here he is using existence, right, and existendieren in terms of how he's talking about the different matters that are coming to our sight in phenomenology. And why would we need a new, better, more adequate, higher element? Well, because we've reached a kind of impasse. We have effectively exhausted what was available, not just in the visual work of art, but also in everything else that was going along with it, the use of space. Now we need something else. And, you might think all the way back to sense certainty, right? What transcends perception and spatiality and even temporality and puts them all into perspective? Language. We talk. So he goes on and he says, the God needs another mode of coming forth than the statue, right? Coming forth, hervorgang, literally, coming out there, which out of the depths of his creative night, he descends into the opposite. The opposite of what? of, we might say, of godhood, into externality, into the determination of the thing which lacks self-consciousness. So what was the thing? The statue, right? And the statue could be treated as if it's the locus of the God, but it doesn't speak to us. It's not part of our distinctively human activity. It stands there kind of dumb, right? And this is what we see in all the critiques of idolatry back in ancient times. Oh, what good are your gods if we can pack them up and take them somewhere and they can't do anything about it? They can't even say, "Help me, I'm being stolen," or anything like that. So he says, this higher element is language. Now, what's so special about language? Well, he tells us right here. An outer reality that is immediately self-conscious existence. Isn't that an interesting way to talk about it? So what is the outer reality? Well, we're experiencing it right now as I'm speaking to you, and you're hearing me, and perhaps you're saying something as well, and maybe there's people in the background talking at the same time that you're trying to listen to this. All of those things are words. They're sounds carried by the air. We can represent them, and reproduce them in a variety of ways. We can write them down, as we have here in Hegel's book. As I read you a passage, we are working with something that is external. Hegel himself has externalized his mind into these pages, which are surviving him because he's long since dead. He's been dead not quite 2 centuries, but closer to 2 centuries than 1 century, and yet there's something that lasts, and that is this higher element. This is, as he says, an outer reality that is immediately self-conscious existence. Now, does that mean that the words themselves have a self-conscious existence? No. Nor do the letters. Nor do the paragraphs. Nor even does the entirety of the book. So what has the self-conscious existence in this case? Well, the language user, right? You and me, or whoever's talking in this paragraph, whoever's being represented, including the God. The God is not only able to be depicted through language, but also to participate in language, as we're going to see in just a bit. So this is quite important. Outer reality, immediately self-conscious existence, right? He goes on and he says, and now here we're going to get several different sides of things. Just as the individual self-consciousness is immediately present in language, well, let's pause on that. How is the individual self-consciousness immediately, unmediatedly, unmittelbar, right, is the idea there. How is it actually unmediatedly or immediately present in language? It says I. It takes positions. It enunciates. It says things. It engages in a variety of linguistic acts, also in relation to other self-consciousnesses, like somebody says, "Oh, it's a lovely day," and somebody else comes along and says, "No, it's not." Right? That's immediate self-consciousness in relation to somebody else, and you're like, jackass, it's cloudy, or something like that. And then the other person can say, oh, don't take it so hard, right? And they're conveying something to you that is partly about you, but is also coming out of their self-consciousness. And now there is all sorts of mediation going on there, of course, right? So this is, to call this, totally immediate is a little bit false, but let's go on. He says, it's also immediately present. Now, what an interesting turn of phrase here, right? As a universal, so we've got our, individual, Einzeln, versus universal, allgemein, but universal what? Universal infection, universal, sharing something in common. When you infect somebody else with a cold, now you have something in common, don't you? I mean, it's not something good to have in common. We can also talk about like emotional infection, but language itself, by its very mimetic basis, is infective. And we are always infecting, being infected at the same time. I mean, how did we learn the language that we actually have? Did we sit down and get the grammar book out? We're talking about our, what we often call our mother language or original language, our primary language. No, we learned it as babies and then infants, those who don't speak but just babble, and then as toddlers by other people talking around us, and we, as we say, picked it up. Well, how did we pick it up? By being infected, right? And this is also going to hold for religious language as well. So he goes on and he says, the complete separation into individual selves is at the same time the fluidity and universally communicated unity of many selves, a community, right? So he goes on and he says, this is a beautiful phrase, language is the soul existing as soul. Seele, right, is used twice in that passage. He says, als Seele existierende Seele, right? So it's soul through language is more than just its psychic reality. It's tapped into a world of others. And this is very important for Hegel, right? That's part of what it means to be a self-consciousness, is that you are aware of yourself as a self, an individual, in relation to many others. And here Hegel doesn't just have it just be one other, but many of them. And who's in the middle of this? The God, right? So he goes on and the next sentence, the God, therefore, who has language for the element of his shape. So this is one of the modes of language. What does it mean to have language for the element of his shape, his gestalt, his, being? It means that the God is talked about. It means that the God is sung about. It means that the God is depicted in a variety of ways. I'm going to look at an example in just a moment. So, what does this look like? He says, the God is the work of art that is in its own self inspired, that possesses immediately in its outer existence the pure activity which, when it existed as a thing, was in contrast to it. Language takes us past this thingliness, in part because, where is language? Well, it's in our heads, it's in the world, it's in our community, it's in the God, and all of us are also in it, in ways different than statuary. And, Hegel's not thinking here at all about theories of language that would reduce language down to a mimicry of the world, but he's blowing that up right now, right? So the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus, Hegel has already refuted him right here, or Russell's logical atomism, or so many other mistaken viewpoints on language. This is much more in line with somebody like, say, Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty or other phenomenologists coming later on. Coming back to this, he says, in other words, self-consciousness in the objectification of its essence abides immediately with itself. This is very important for Hegel, abiding immediately with itself. Abiding thus with itself in its essence, it is pure thought. Or the devotion whose inwardness, now here's another important mode, in the hymn has at the same time an outer existence. It retains within itself the individuality of self-consciousness This individuality is at the same time heard as a universal individuality that is immediately present. So we've got both sides coming together here in this. And then he says, devotion kindled in the manifold units. Manifold units would be on the side of the many who are part of the universal of self-consciousness, is conscious of its act as the act of all alike and as simple beings. So we have the formation of not just a bunch of individuals, but of a community centered on the God and centered on the devotion through the medium of hymn. Now, what is a hymn? If we're thinking in modern times, we might say, oh, well, that's a religious song, and that's, correct in a certain way. It's not exactly what Hegel has in mind. So I thought it could be good to give you an example of a Homeric hymn, which it means that it's something attributed to Homer, not that Homer actually wrote this, but this is, probably used liturgically in some way. And there are so many of these. Some of them are quite long, some of them are quite short. I thought we would start with looking at the one to Athena, since, patroness of wisdom and all those connections, right? But there's plenty to Artemis, to Demeter, to Hestia, to Apollo. We could go on and on and on. So here's the hymn. I begin to sing of Pallas Athena, the glorious goddess, bright-eyed, inventive, unbending of heart, pure virgin, savior of cities, courageous, Tritogenia. From his awful head wise Zeus himself bare her, arrayed in warlike arms of flashing gold, and awe seized all the gods as they gazed. But Athena sprang quickly from the immortal head and stood before Zeus, who holds the aegis, shaking a sharp spear. Great Olympus began to reel horribly at the might of the bright-eyed goddess, and earth round about cried fearfully, and the sea was moved and tossed with dark waves, while foam burst forth. Suddenly the bright son of Hyperion stopped his swift-footed horses a long while, until the maiden Pallas Athena had stripped the heavenly armor from her immortal shoulders, and wise Zeus was glad. And so, hail to you, daughter of Zeus, who holds the aegis. Now I will remember you, and another song as well. This is, quite something. What's going on here in this? There's an invocation. I begin to sing of Pallas Athena, the glorious goddess. All these epithets, right? Descriptive things. Then we have some drama taking place. We have the famous story of her coming out of Zeus's head that's been cleaved or cloven, I'm not sure which, open, and comes out dressed in armor with her sharp spear. And then it ends by saying, why Zeus was glad. So that brings that narrative to a conclusion. And then once again addressing the goddess, hail to you, daughter of Zeus. Now I will remember you, in another song as well. And so this is a bringing the god, in this case, the goddess Athena, into a linguistic framework, one that I can read and then you can respond to, and which echoes other things that have been said, and which could be appropriated and put into other means. This could be, of course, set to music. It is a kind of poetry already, right? Palad Athenaian Kudrein Theon, in the Greek, it's got its own sort of meter to it. And so this is, again, a very important transition point for Hegel in what is happening. So he tells us that devotion, right, is conscious of its act as the act of all alike and as simple being. Both of these sides at the same time. Spirit, as this universal self-consciousness of all, has its pure inwardness, no less than the being for others and the being for self of the individuals. Spirit has all of this in a single unity, centered through this element of language on the God. This language is distinct from another language of the God, which is not that of universal self-consciousness. The oracle, both the God of the religions of art and of the preceding religions, is the necessary first form of the God's utterance. For the notion of the God implies that he is the essence of both nature and spirit, and therefore has not only natural but spiritual existence as well. Insofar as this moment is at first merely implied in his notion and not yet realized in religion, the language is, for the religious self-consciousness, the language of an alien self-consciousness. The self-consciousness that is still alien to its community is not yet immediately present in the manner demanded by its notion. The self is simple or unitary and thereby absolutely universal being for self. But the self that is separated from the self-consciousness of the community is at first only an individual self. The content of this, its own and individual language, stems from the universal determinateness in which absolute spirit in general is posited in its religion. Thus, the universal spirit of the sunrise, which has not yet particularized its existence, utters equally simple and universal statements about the divine being, the substantial content of which is sublime in its simple truth, but on account of this universality at the same time appears trivial to the progressively developing self-consciousnesses. In paragraph 711, Hegel is telling us something by way of contrast about what he's just developed in the previous paragraph, where we saw that certain kinds of language can be the better, the higher element for spirit to help us make sense of the gods, of ourselves, through our community, through language. And he's looking backwards now and saying, so, the language of the hymns, the language in which the God is described, takes on a shape, a gestalt, describes itself, that is not the language that we had earlier of the oracle, right? That's going to be different. He says this language is distinct from another language of the God, which is not that of universal self-consciousness. Now, looking at the rest of this paragraph, there is something universal about it, but notice what he says. This universality and the statements that the oracle gives are in some respect kind of trivial. They don't have the adequacy that these other types, and those are just scratching the surface because we're going to see, we're going to talk about epic pretty soon and other kinds of poetry, that those provide. Well, why not? So, here he's saying, listen, we're talking about something that is involved in the other religions of art, so things in this section, and the religions prior to that in this religion section. What are those? The religions of nature, where we take, crystalline objects or, shapes and plants and animals, and finally start making artwork in kind of a more crude sense before we get to the religions of art. And we might also think about the religions that were talked about at other places in the spirit section and in the self-consciousness section. What would be the religion of the self-consciousness section? That of the unhappy consciousness, right? So he's saying the oracle is the necessary, notwendig, right, first form of the God's utterance. And here Miller is being a little periphrastic. The first form of the God's utterance? No, the first Sprache, the first language that the God is spoken of or speaks through. Presumably the oracle is the oracle of the God. And he says the notion of the God, here's a really interesting point. The notion of the God, the Begriff, the concept, implies that he is the essence of both nature and spirit, right? Natur und Geist. And he is the essence, the Wesen. So you could say, okay, he's the essence of both of these, in the sense that, both are sort of reflections of the God, that's actually probably the wrong way to look at it. Instead, think of the God as straddling both realms. He is an essence. He's a being, a Wesen. Wesen has both of these senses, who is both natural and spiritual. And, what is the goal here? To overcome this distinction. So he says he has not only natural but spiritual existence. Spiritual existence, geistige existence, means existence for us human beings. What would be another example of this sort of thing? What's freedom? Is freedom a natural thing? A lot of people who try to reduce it to something that can be figured in terms of nature, but no, spirit is a geistige, a spiritual notion or experience or reality or Wesen, an essence. So he goes, insofar as this moment is at first merely implied in his notion and not yet realized, not yet brought forth in religion, the language is, what's the language? The language of the oracle. For the religious self-consciousness, the language of an alien self-consciousness. The God is somebody alien to me, somebody foreign, somebody perhaps even opposed to, that I can't really grasp or understand. Now, where have we encountered this before? Unhappy consciousness, right? And in other places in this religion section. And here he says something that's really interesting. He says the self-consciousness that is still alien to its community, who's that? That's the God. The God is alien to the God's own community of worshipers, of believers, of those who are talking about the God. The God is in a certain way. Okay, we could understand this in the sense like Rudolf Otto talked about God as being, or the divine as being wholly other. This isn't quite that, but the God is uncanny. The God is not really fitting in with us, and the oracle has its mysteriousness as a result. So he says, here we go, the self-consciousness still alien to its community is not immediately present, unmediatedly present in the matter demanded by its notion. The self is simple or unitary, therefore absolutely universal being for self. Now, who's the universal being for self here, we should ask? Is it the God? Is it the single worshiper? Is it the community as such? Well, then he says, the self that is separated from the self-consciousness of the community is at first only an individual self. That makes it sound as if the God, through the communication of the oracle, is actually an individual and, estranged or foreign self. And it's the community that is the universal being for self. And the God is kind of, on the outskirts, bursting in through the revelation of the divine, but not really fitting in. So he goes on and he says, the content of this, its own and individual language, the language of the oracle, the weirdness of it, right, stems from the universal determinateness in which absolute spirit in general is posited in its religion. So we see the universal coming back in now, and he says the universal spirit of the sunrise, which has not yet particularized its existence, utters equally simple and universal statements about the divine being, the substantial content of which is sublime in its simple truth, but on account of this universality at the same time appears trivial to the progressively developing self-consciousness. So, a certain stage of religion, the God says cool stuff that's universal about itself, about other gods, about human nature, about whatever. And, it sounds really interesting, but when you start pulling it apart, you're like, yeah, I don't know that they're actually communicating that much here. This God who is, at Pythia or wherever else, right? What's actually being conveyed? The oracle is not really, an oracle in its language is not an adequate element for what's going on in religion, which is the development of self-consciousness, being conscious of itself in religion. And so we get this kind of void, or what do we have here going on past this? As I mentioned at the beginning of this, Hegel is actually sort of casting a backward glance. He's not saying that we move from, what's been discussed in paragraph 710, this new mode of self-conscious language, back to the oracle. We're actually saying, look how far we've come. The oracle's over here, and that's clearly not working anymore for progressive self-consciousness. Now we've got this other kind over here, which is better, more adequate to the demands of spirit.